Welcome to Decoded, the podcast that decodes the design, technology, and experiences shaping our world and planet. I am Elisa Leñero.
And I'm Saima Ahmed Christensen. Together we explore the systems, behaviors, and technologies influencing how we live, work, and connect, from human interactions to the ecosystems we are part of.
Each episode is a conversation with technologists, designers, entrepreneurs, and everyday users. Join us.
Hi, welcome back to the show. I'm Saima Ahmed Christensen, and I'm a professor of design engineering and innovation, and also director of DigitLab, a research center exploring design and digital technologies based in the University of Exeter.
And I'm Elisa. I'm a designer by training and currently rediscovering what design is in times where the world is challenged in many different ways, from the artificial intelligence revolution to deep societal changes and massive ecosystem destruction. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Michael Thomas. He studied engineering and computer science at Cambridge University, and in the early 80s worked at the British Telecom Research Labs, Martlesham Heath, on photo video techs and interactive cable TV systems. He then moved to Newcastle, working for BT Applied Technologies, now Syntegra, which included design and implementing large-scale terminal systems for the UK DSS and document image processing for Companies House. Moving further north, Mike joined the Hewlett-Packard Telecom Systems division, becoming the systems architect for their SS7 signaling monitoring systems, comprising many hundreds of Unix Linux computers, processing distributing signaling messages. And after taking early retirement, well done, Mike has been volunteering with Spinal Injuries Scotland, Thistle Outdoors, and the Adaptive Writers Collective, as well as collaborating on several inclusive design projects run by the Transport Research Institute at the Edinburgh Napier University. Welcome, Michael.
Good to be here.
And welcome, Pat. Professor Patrick Langdon is director of the Transport Research Institute and a professor of engineering design, transportation and inclusion at Edinburgh Napier School of Computing, Engineering and the Built Environment. He is also an experimental psychologist and has worked in AI, robotics and engineering design for over 20 years. Historically, he has led research into inclusive design and contributed to its literature. Most recently, his research has looked at disabled access to small aircraft and terminals, making curbs and streets more inclusive, particularly in Scotland, and improving the safety of tram and bus driving in Edinburgh and Hungary, as well as looking at public attitudes to autonomous buses and cars and driving simulations for European-style zebra crossings. So he aims to improve sustainable travel for the wider inclusive population. And in today's episode, we'll be exploring the theme of inclusive design, particularly with a focus on travel and better, safer streets, more inclusive streets. So welcome to both our guests, Professor Pat Langdon and Michael Thomas. So Pat, we've known each other for almost 30 years or so. So I was curious that you said started research 20 years ago. But, and we met while you were doing inclusive design in the University of Cambridge. And at that point, there was a lot of focus on understanding and quantifying how users are excluded, developing toolkits that allowed designers to understand users. For example, there were glasses that you could wear that simulated different types of different vision impairments, or gloves that simulated dexterity. And since then, your work has really evolved. So you've discussed, I mentioned in the bio a bit about the autonomous vehicles type work, but also your work with transportation and plane travel in the UK. So I was thinking maybe we could start by you quickly saying what you mean by inclusive design. What does inclusive design mean?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think it's a misunderstood term.
So I'll try and hash out what it really is as far as I'm concerned. But one thing is clear, is it was underpinned by the work done in the Engineering Design Centre at the University of Cambridge, where I was with you for quite a long time. But since then, it's also been the basis of a lot of the research I've been doing. And in fact, even the research into what you might describe as mainstream transportation, I've always tried to turn round to consider inclusion. And the type of inclusion we started off in those days at Cambridge was all about quantifying capability. So understanding how capability varies across the population by age, gender, and other factors. And that was very successful, and it yielded a very interesting, what was known as an analytical approach to inclusion, where you could calculate, if you had the right data, how many people would be excluded from using a product by looking at the demand made by the product on different scales of analytic scales of inclusion, such as visual capability, hearing capability, physical movement, and so on. So I think you get the idea of that. However, that approach is very distant from actually the end user. And so as my work went on over the years, and I was required to perform operations in different types of domain in transport and other areas, in fact, not just transportation, but things like other areas of design, for example, for communications technology and other things, inclusion was always involved as far as I was concerned, and I would actually bring it in. So fast forwarding to the present, the most recent work I've been doing at Edinburgh Napier University, instead of inclusion being about what the phrase is used now, which is the wider sense of inclusion, we kind of stop at the level of all the things I've just mentioned, plus neurodiversity, and also systemic medical issues such as diabetes, heart disease, and so forth, which would in effect weaken you. So that's kind of the outline of the kind of scope, if you like, of the sort of approach we take. And the approach I still take is one of trying to match the demand made by the task or the product with the capabilities of the potential users. And that's proved to be a fantastic platform to look at things like boarding an aircraft or indeed walking through the streets of a city like Edinburgh.
Hmm. And you've said that so some of your work has been looking at traveling by plane, for example, in
Mhm.
Scotland and UK. And there's some inclusion issues that everyone touches on, you've stated
Yeah,
to us.
yeah,
So what
absolutely.
are these issues? Can you unfold a little bit? And maybe Mike can come in as well on these
Okay,
perspectives.
right. So first and foremost, this work has been funded by the Innovate UK, United Kingdom Research Council, and it was funded as a consortium which involved companies that were developing hydrogen electric aircraft for regional and sub-regional transport. So these are small aircraft, two engines, propellers usually, and they're quite close to the ground when they're sitting on the tarmac. Don't get out of your mind the big jets. These are the smaller aircraft. And the principle of the research was that these hydrogen-powered aircraft would be green. So it's a revolution in aviation. If it catches on, if you like, for want of a better phrase, then we will have to think about aviation differently. And so one of the issues that was a working package, if you like, for that project that was tackled by Edinburgh Napier University, the Transport Research Institute, which, by the way, I'm the director of, was how inclusive are these small aircraft for people who want to obviously travel that way, and they do. People do. I think when we talk about how inclusive, what we're really saying here is that there are two sides to traveling today in aviation. One side is what we might describe as the big jets, big airports, okay? And that's a fantastically, well, it's a really up-to-date topic because there's a huge amount of interest in how difficult people have been finding this when they are in the disabled communities. Okay, so that's one of the first things to say. And that's, I think Mike will be able to talk to that as well. And one of the first things we did in the project was we looked at people's experience all over the country in their experiences of using these current modern terminals and the current modern aircraft, and indeed the ways of getting in and out of the current modern aircraft. We didn't really make any distinction, but there was an inclusion in it. So we were interested in how people, for example, with wheelchairs, or how people had carer that assisted them, people with visual impairments and so on, how they were interested. That was part of that research. And then the next part of the research, if you like, was to then use that and contrast it with a completely new approach. So we're going to have a new type of aviation that's green and not dirty and emissions and things. And we're going to fly them regionally and sub-regionally. So there's not major issues to do with visas and passports and things like that. We'll come back to that later if you like. But the idea is those smaller aircraft are optimal for that sort of economic model. And one of the things the project did was design new terminals with an architectural partner in the consortium, Weston Williamson and Partners Limited in London. They designed a new sustainable terminal made out of wood. And the idea was that there was also a complete automated replication, if you like, of air traffic control and all the other facilities that these larger airports require for safety. Okay, so our part of that was to think about how inclusive the new terminal design was, bearing in mind that it was done by an architectural practice who are specialists in inclusion as well. But also, what about the issues of actually getting in and out of these smaller planes? On the face of it, a difficult and challenging area. And of course, Mark he wanted to work with us on that, and we wanted to have somebody to do co-design of our design. So our aim was to understand the difficulties of getting in and out of smaller aircraft, and then having understood it, we went through a series of design exercises, which I'm sure you would be proud of, having been in the Engineering Design Centre, and that design process brought us through to a number of alternative designs, which we then eventually secured a kind of understanding of which one would be the most inclusive. And eventually we developed a prototype based on that, which Mike had the pleasure of testing.
Right. And Mike, can you walk us through a little bit more about this process, and what are the inclusion issues that you were touching on? I know that has been mentioned, like in and out of the aircraft, but I'm sure that there are many, many more that we are not touching on.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I got roped into this was 35 years ago, I had a skiing injury which resulted in a spinal injury. So I'm paralyzed from the chest down, a wheelchair user. And when I moved to Hewlett Packard, I actually did a lot of international travel as part of the work. So I flew to the Far East and mostly to the States. So I had a huge amount of experience of the intricacies of airline travel. So this was part of the reason that I was roped in by Pat to give a sort of lived experience to help with the design process. There's all sorts everything takes a lot longer if you're disabled, and it's always fraught with challenges, finding out where you want to go. You have to be helped onto the airplane. The airplane aisles aren't big enough, so you've got to get into a separate chair to be able to get down. The big jet experience, as Pat has said, is actually fairly well done now, in that what's going to happen. You'll get into an ambi lift, or if it's on a jet bridge, you'll transfer into they call it an aisle chair, or the Americans call it straight back, which is this narrow chair, and then you get help down the aisle like that, and then you either transfer or you're helped out. But the small aeroplanes are a lot more of a challenge. In fact, after my accident, I did learn to fly, so I used to get myself in and out of a small plane. However, that involved shuffling up the wing on my backside and dragging my chair up after me, which may be suitable for me, but that is not a design outcome that you would be able to choose for the general public. The smaller aircraft are a real challenge, because these ambi lifts, they're basically the same sort of vehicle you'll see that delivers food and drinks to airplanes. Effectively, they adapt those for PRM, we're called persons of reduced mobility, to help them onto an airplane. and they don't fit onto a smaller aeroplane. In fact, I did once I was meant to be flying to to Copenhagen, and the Danes treat you as a medical case. So in Edinburgh, they would get me onto the airplane by lifting me on. In Copenhagen, they wouldn't do that. So I ended up being sent down to Heathrow and then up to Stockholm, and to avoid getting onto a smaller plane. That was a good few years ago. Things have improved slightly, but getting into smaller airplanes, as Pat has said, it's not so high off the ground. The doors are smaller, the wings are in the way, the engines are in the way. It's a really interesting design challenge. So that was my part of bringing the lived experience to work that Pat and the guys were doing.
Can I just ask you, when you said lifting you, like people lifting you to be putting you
transfer into an aisle chair, and then they would physically lift you. Now
Okay.
there are others. I mean, in Frankfurt, I have been in a chair it's got 3 wheels and will climb the aircraft steps. I mean,
Right.
it
Yeah.
looks. I mean, there are all sorts in the state, Sacramento. Messrs. Heath and Robinson had designed a device involving ladders and wires that basically allowed you to go along effectively a big long ramp to get you into a smaller aeroplane. So there are various different ways of doing it, but none of them were particularly good or safe, which is why Pat's looking at something that's more sensible, and you need something at the other end as well. So something that can be transported with the aeroplane that's not too heavy and not too big.
For the people that haven't used these devices that you are mentioning, can you just briefly also explain to us, like, why they are not safe, why they are not the best solution that has been designed for people with reduced mobility?
Well, in talking specifically about wheelchair users, people come in all shapes and sizes and all different capabilities. The IATA, the International Airline Transport Association, I think they classify people PRM. You get classified into 3 different groups, whether you can walk or go upstairs, but if you can't walk or go upstairs, everybody is lumped into the one category. So you will have people who may be very heavy and can't move at all, so will need physically lifting and probably have a sling in their wheelchair. So ideally, you'd have some sort of lift, winch, whatever, to get people in, or someone like me who can transfer myself on and off. And the people who are the special assistance staff have no idea who they're dealing with.
Exactly.
It's and we're not going to change IATA categories because
Right.
yeah.
So look, basically what you are telling us is that there's a lot of holes throughout the system, right? Like there's a lot of holes from different stakeholders. Super interesting. Thank you. And then, so what has been kind of not only the research, but what has been the some of the solutions that have been designed?
Well, the one that Pat's come up with, Pat's teams have come up with that we all worked through was using drills and effectively a winch to sit on the aeroplane. So it's fitted to the aeroplane, to part of the aeroplane that is stable, and everything in aviation is controlled. You have to have everything done it's got to meet standards. So it's got to, you can't have things that fall off, and so it's
Should
been
I
quite a
answer
job
that,
to get
maybe?
something.
Should I answer
Yeah,
that,
that's a
Mike?
good.
Yeah, Pet,
'Cause I
maybe
think,
come in and talk a little bit about, because you've done research on it. It'd be good to talk
yes.
about the research, but also
Oh,
about how
totally.
you've also adopted it, and you're working with industry with it. So
That's right.
if that'd be really good to hear that perspective.
Yeah, so interestingly, Mike talks about his experience, which I think is fair. We're the designers, we were the people who did the research. So what we originally started with is as you would do in a good design project, just to say that the government has a plan for introducing hydrogen into aviation, and the first layer of that likely to be realised will be the use of gaseous hydrogen. Okay, in the case of this project, it was with fuel cells, which provide electricity to an electric motor that acts as a motor for the propeller. Now, the point about that is it's limited in range. And so that was an accepted part of it. Gaseous hydrogen takes up quite a large volume compared to liquid hydrogen. So it's going to be a relatively short range. So we're talking hundreds of miles, no more. And that limits, if you like, the way in which the aircraft can be designed and configured. Usually you have an overhead wing, propellers and undercarriage slung underneath. The doorway is behind those towards the tail of the plane. Usually there's one on each side as an emergency exit as well. And also it's quite close to the ground. In fact, in the Britten-Norman Islander, which was the aircraft of the project, which is, by the way, the world standard for island hopping in small aircraft. They use it in the Scottish Highlands to go out to the islands, in places like Barra, where there's no runway to speak of. So you just need a very short takeoff and landing capability, which is why you have to use these planes. So the Britten-Norman Islander was our key aircraft as a trial, almost the most difficult case you could think of. There's no aisle in the Britten-Norman Islander. There's just bench seats inside going across. Oh yeah, it's even for somebody like myself, it's a struggle to get into them. If indeed I could get in, I'm not
How
really.
do you go from the beginning to the end if there's no aisle?
You don't. You get in and you either get in and get out through either front exit or the rear exit. It's a 12-seater, I think. It's not a very big aircraft. I mean, but it is popular around the world because it's used by hotels to take, guests to the golf course or something like that, or it's used in the UK predominantly because it's.
I can tell you that. Yeah, I'm just giving away that I haven't been invited by hotels for golf courses, right?
No,
Because I
that's
haven't
right.
seen them.
It's also used for other purposes. So well, I mean,
I've used it around
the
the Philippines, and I remember landing where
That's
there's no
right.
runway, exactly how you said.
Yeah.
Taxis waiting for the plane to take off before they could move. Everybody's on the same little bit of land.
Yeah.
So basically,
It sounds like a niche, but the point about this is you've got to, whatever you design has to travel with the aircraft. So it has to be light enough and it has to break down into pieces so that you can put it into the aircraft. This is because as you land on a sandy beach, there is nobody there. There's nobody going to come with an ambulift, right? So, this device. Now, because of civil aviation and FAA regulations and regulation in this country, you cannot attach anything to the frame of the object, of the aircraft. So you have to be removable. It has to be, it's a design issue. So you've got to design something.
So Pat, so can you explain, so is it a device that's removable and then put in the plane and taken with you? Is that how
that's exactly
and
that.
can it go in all planes?
Yeah, of course.
Or is there
No, hold on. No. The mechanism by which you clamp it onto the aircraft is required for safety. So, obviously, if you're going to lift a 50, 60 kilo person, you need to have a safe basis to do so. And so this is basically like a lift. It's like a little lift with a rotating seat so that the passenger approaches on their wheelchair. They slide off their wheelchair onto the seat, rotate into the right orientation with respect to the aircraft, and then it lifts, and it can be lifted by an internal motor. We've got an internal motor mic on the new ones, and also in the prototype, we were using a Black & Decker drill type thing as a motive force for the lead screw, Simon, in engineering terms, is the mechanism by which the lift operates. So that's how it works. And when they get to the height and the proximity of the seating, they then can slide across. And particularly people like Mike, who are strong and capable of doing it, as you can see, he can do it. He can slide into his car, he can slide into a light aircraft, he can slide across. So that was the principle on which the most successful design, turned out to be because you've got to consider these other issues. It's got to be light enough, it's got to break down, it's got to carry, and so on and so forth. But it's also the best design from the point of view of making or facilitating the movement by people who have got capability issues as well. So we had a long design process involving creative design workshops, technical workshops, which are very important because you don't want to design something that can't be built or won't operate. So you have to start with a technical requirements analysis. You have to start with the initial regulatory issues, because there's no point in doing anything that can't be regulated. And also you have to talk to the potential users and say, what the hell, would you like this? Is this good? Is this bad? And Mike attended several of our creative workshops and our technical workshops where we actually discussed with people with disabilities what their requirements might be and what they thought of a range of designs. And then eventually, after an inclusion analysis, we did a Pew matrix, which I'm sure you'll be glad to hear, as it brings us down to earth on the design side of things as well. And then that design was then built with the help of a robotics manufacturer who were part of the consortium. And well, as Mike knows, we started testing it and trialing it with we built a fuselage simulation. So with an exact replica of the doorways of the aircraft. And we use that as a proof of concept, if you like, of the idea. So that's it from top to bottom, really. And it was very successful. And it's not all mine. Other people tested it. A lady called Michelle, she was very pleased with it. And for example, the sort of thing people say is that they don't like being manipulated in aisle chairs. You know, it's not a pleasant scenario. I mean, Mike's something of an athlete, so he doesn't mind too much about that sort of thing. You know, some people do, and they don't like being sort of brutally moved around. They want to be in control of their environment. Michelle was a very good example. She's about 28. She's a young paraplegic, but she wants to be in charge of what's going on. She doesn't want to be treated like baggage. And she was very pleased with that and the security and the confidence that this approach actually gave her.
And so you've tested it with many different users, as you're saying. And Mike has also, sorry, no, go ahead.
No, we were unable to test it with, for example, with people with hearing deficiencies, or the budget of the project didn't allow for us to test with anything other than the main cases, which in this case is physical. But the analysis in the inclusive design report covers all of the possible. So, for example, we looked at the visibility of instructions. We looked at the cognitive requirements of using the system. We looked at what the carer role might be to assist. We looked at whether they would be able to do it themselves. We looked at what do they physically do in the task analysis of using it. What would they have to do? Pull this pin, adjust, whatever, because you have to fold up I don't know if you remember, Mike, but you have to fold up you have to be in a harness to avoid unsafe scenario when you're up high, and you need to have arms on the chair so that people can't slip out of it. And every little issue in design, as you know, is potentially a design killer. So you've got to be there.
And this one, I think you highlighted that you have instructions that have to be clear. So who would be the people who would be operating it? Would they be from the plane companies? And you've done your prototype. So how would you see the next phase of getting that adopted?
Right. Well, that is it's a Pandora's box, if you like, for people who aren't familiar with the aviation industry. So in some aircraft, the pilot acts as a conductor, if you like, for want of a better phrase. So they then would be responsible for loading the passengers on, or in the case of this device, deploying the device. The device can't be deployed on your own. I mean, we wanted it to be, but I don't think it's going to be conceivable that you could ask somebody like Mike to actually deploy the different parts and put them all together. Although I think he'd probably give it a good go, actually. But what would happen is, I think, is that when you get to the point of controlling the motor that causes the lift to lift, that wasn't a particularly finessed part of the design. And in fact, since then we've made a revised version with an inbuilt motor. So in theory, you might just be able to do it yourself, actually, by flicking a switch. But yeah, the idea was there would be a person, right? Now, in airports or places like, say, for example, Venice or up in the islands, they have a different role. So there's somebody who's a PRM representative would bring the passenger, who might be Mike, for example, out to the aircraft, and then I think Mike, would I be right in saying that they would have to then do it?
Well, one of the challenges is that anything that's fitted to an aircraft has to be normally done. The CAA mandated by a qualified engineer. So, it's going to have, the design has to take into account that, putting this on is not going to damage the airframe, and can be done by trained staff. One of the instances I had, because Pat was talking about the number of people at smaller airports. When I went to a small airport at Karlstad in Sweden, the guy who helped with the luggage, who put me on the aircraft, he then got onto the de-icer and de-iced the aeroplane and then sat in the fire engine. So there was only one guy who was doing absolutely everything at that airport. And this is going to be typical for small aircraft. This aircraft then flew me back to Copenhagen, where the paramedics got me off. So it obviously would be possible at some point, but yeah,
Part of the
small
remit of the
aircraft
project,
is a challenge.
yeah, part of the remit of the project was to look at these other issues. So to understand the regulatory environment, which in these sort of situations is part of the design. I mean, you can't avoid it. For example, if you get people into the aircraft, they have to be able to exit through the emergency exit in the event of a crash. They have to do it within a record time. I think, what is the time? It's something like 30 seconds or something like that. So they have to get out of the aircraft through the emergency. So there's a whole raft of regulation that you have to take into account if you're going to build a real prototype and actually use it. And so that was part of the remit of the project. And I would say that successful design projects as part of research, as proof of concept, they need to do that. You need to address the wider, ramifications of a design. Nobody can get away anymore with just doing the engineering alone, although it was very well
Yeah,
done by
well,
our engineering partner.
exactly. Well said. I think it hasn't been it doesn't have to be done only by one group of experts. They have to bring more voices, and that's another episode that we had previously. But but what we're being hearing so far is a project that has been funded, right, by UK RI, and that's amazing. We should be having more of those projects. But I am sure that both of you and more people have noticed the evidence of data and lack of inclusion around the world. So how do you approach also those type of projects where data probably is not there? It's more like through lived experience, or there's a gap in data, there's a gap in research. How do you approach those projects
Yeah, I
or
mean, I
those
think this is
challenges?
fundamental to the way I've been working for the last 25 years. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm going to go on a small segue here because I think it's illustrative of the situation. So, the work we were doing at Cambridge regarded cognitive uh, exclusion, if you like, for want of a better phrase. So, this is the idea that people with dementia or people with varying conditions which affect their cognitive capabilities, their thinking capabilities, how that might influence the design of everyday objects, white goods, whatever it is, to make it less likely to bamboozle them or befuddle them, and allow them to use these things. So there's that cognitive element was part of my design theory research, and I have publications in that area. And so it's very interesting because when you end up talking about, well, okay, we must have a big, bright, and colourful, because that's a good way of interacting with people with dementia, for example, which is not dissimilar from interacting with children. If you're designing for children. And there are other things such as sequencing to support the loss of memory or short-term memory, and so on. So what happened? This segue takes us in the direction of mainstreaming my work. So I was doing work in that area, looking at how certain types of physical capability impairments affected people's use of mice with computers. And I presented that to a large automotive OEM, and they were interested in the potential for it in one of their projects, which was to do with using touchscreens in moving vehicles. Okay. So the segue is, and this is a design issue, we were able to develop a way of using touchscreens in a bouncing vehicle. And as most vehicles do, they bounce, but A Jaguar Land Rover, they bounce a lot because of off-road capability. And that is a very difficult task. So luckily, we had developed a way of doing it for people with cerebral palsy. So that's an interesting design segue, because that was then a bridge between what might have been a relatively small area of research into mainstream. Right? So suddenly, JLR were interested in how they could get their touchscreens used using the same algorithms as we were using for cerebral palsy. So that gives you an idea of how, it underpins now mainstream. And the reason ultimately is because the use of of controls in vehicles, planes, aircraft, whatever it might be, is basically a matter of information overload for the most part. So most modern cars and aircraft and so on are overloading the user or the driver or the pilot. So they have to be designed better to do that. And so that's been that gives you an idea of how deeply that piece of research underpins not just disabled use, but also mainstream use. And I've been able to exploit that in many years of research into interface design. So there you are. You've got disability research directly informing mainstream research.
Yeah,
there.
that's interesting, because it's like the in defense, you talk a lot about dual application or
Mhm.
dual use research. So it may be done for one application, but thinking of that wider application is very relevant. So it's interesting, it's starting from a completely different area, from inclusive design, which
Yeah.
might be seen for a little area. So we've talked a little bit about transportation and the role of lifting and having access into those planes. And I think we may be partly underplaying the impact of that, because this is opening really new experiences that probably weren't possible without these devices. These devices are adopted. Suddenly, the use of small planes, even if it's a hotel inviting you as a, or it's just, I don't know what the other use, island hopping, but it suddenly opens new experiences and new possibilities in a dignified manner.
I think I'll
In there.
just say, I'm sorry to see
Yeah.
interrupting you, but very importantly, 40% of flights by the carrier Logan Air in the islands are in fact of NHS origin.
Yeah.
Okay, so that
Yeah,
there in those areas, it's very expensive to move people to oncology appointments, or to take people to jail, or there's a whole range of things which are public service obligations. And so the
yes.
government has made it an obligation for certain companies to actually do it. I mean, the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is helicopters and things like that, which cost thousands of pounds a
So it's
minute.
not just a luxury travel; it's access to really key services that are,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
obviously maybe you don't,
life
yeah, that
saving,
are
life
really
saving
important.
service.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and life saving
yeah,
in
yeah.
there. And another piece of work that you've talked about or mentioned to us outside of transportation, I wonder if we could move to understanding inclusion in the streets.
Yeah, this is a very interesting exact case in point of what we've been talking about. So in the Transport Research Institute, we were approached by the consultancy Mott MacDonald, who incidentally were part of the aviation project as well. They do a lot of work on the design of terminals in big aviation. We were approached to help them understand how the disabled community are, and in fact, all users are affected by the design of the curbs in streets in urban areas. The motivation for this was because there's a lot of legacy stuff out there, particularly, for example, in Edinburgh, where, as you can imagine, or maybe in Cambridge, there's massive legacy issues there to do with the older legacy buildings and so forth. And when they introduced new technology, the new what should we call it? Their means by which they can control the transportation demand. So this is the new approach to transport in the UK and other countries, is demand management, to control demand. And so very often they introduce the idea of throttling back car use and increasing the use of things like cycleways and so forth, public transportation areas and so on. So when they do that, and when they introduce, say, low traffic zones, they have to change all the curbing and all the streets. And the modern approach is to use either low or non-existent curbs, as you will know, Soma, because when you were in Imperial College, there was a whole street outside of where you were working that was converted to this sort of
Yeah,
idea.
Exhibition Road.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
This idea from Denmark that you don't need any curbs and you can kind of just put studs in the road to indicate where things are. But
From
it's not about
Netherlands.
that.
I think the idea is from Netherlands, actually.
I can't remember the guy's name, but
Yeah.
he developed
Yeah.
it as a roundabout.
Yeah.
And it's not had a great history in this country because at the moment the government forbids the development of any more of those because of issues that have resulted as a consequence of misunderstanding what would happen when you introduce them in the UK, particularly at very busy junctions. So they wanted to think about it, but they haven't got the background in psychology and inclusion, so they turned to me directly. And what we did is we designed a project to look at, firstly and foremost, what the curves were like. So initially, the logical thing that all scientists do, we found out what's the situation actually currently, so we know how bad it is. And we conducted a survey with the McDonald team of 56 sites in different cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh, and we looked at the visual contrasts of the curves as well, because obviously people with low vision are sensitive to contrast differences between parts of the surfaces that they're walking on or whatever, or wheeling on. We looked at, they wanted to look at the issues to do with the noise of the environment as well and so on. So we did a big engineering survey of a large number of locations. And then I think this is when you got into the project, Mike. After that, we moved into a phase of trying to understand as a complete approach to the design of future curves, you need to really get our heads around everything that's important. So we wanted to talk about the lived experience of using the streets. If you have a wheelchair, or if you use a stick, if you are have low vision or you're visually impaired, you use a cane, for example, you rely on a guide dog. All those things were part of the remit of this project. I mean, interestingly, prior to this work being done, there was next to no research at all in this area. There was a little bit of research in London in the 90s to do with a big facility that UCL built, but apart from that, it had always been anecdote and legacy information that was used by road engineers to decide. And usually this contained things like there's exact measurements for the design of a crossing, and nobody knew where they came from, as is commonly the case with these things. So on the principle
similar to the lightings, right? Like some of the lightings, like when they're crossing, like the amount of time that they're giving you, it's incredible. Like that's not enough for someone that has a cane or it's
what we don't realize is
that's a failure that I've noticed. During the
so road engineers, politicians, policymakers, they're using information and nobody knows where it came from. So basically what we need to do as researchers is start evidencing the important things that are required. So on that basis, that's what we proposed. So firstly, we got a collection of individuals that represented different strata of disability. Mike was amongst them. Then we took them out onto the streets. We asked them to traverse a section of roadway and then cross at a certain point. And then as they did so, we videoed them. They did a little videograph of what they were doing. They give a commentary of what they were feeling, thinking. Their reminiscences. You'll remember doing it, Mike. I think it was fantastically effective.
Yeah, and we got taken all around different places in Edinburgh, trying different types of curb, and we got the new tram or the tram in places, and some of the curbs there were brand new. I mean, a lot of the stuff has just been installed, so it was interesting to see that. That may not be great.
We were responding also to complaints from interviews we'd done with people from all over Scotland, Glasgow in particular, about new cycleway initiatives, which proved to be dramatically dangerous for wheelchair users and also for people with visual impairments. So, this is the sort of stuff that your politicians boast about having installed. It then turns out the curbs are incredibly difficult for these people, well, for people in these categories to use, and they've managed to cock up both of them. So that's not the language,
Yeah, that's
but
quite
Same.
interesting
Also
because
with women with the boogies, like you cannot
yes,
go with your. There are
yeah,
many
exactly.
cases, right? As we were saying
Yeah.
about the dual. And Mike, can I ask you about like that's from like Pat is talking from a research perspective, but in your perspective as well, how would you evidence the lack of inclusion on different areas? That how can you also make people more not people only, but like as Pat was saying, like people that are designing crucial areas for mobility in cities, or people are making decisions like decision makers, like policy makers as well. Like how can you help us also like evidence those kind of areas where there's massively lack of inclusion?
Remember, my lived experience came about 35 years ago when I had no idea about this, what life was like as a wheelchair user at all until then. I see all of you as tabs, temporarily able-bodied. Yeah. So hopefully you'll remain that way all through your life. But, a lot of people.
It's already going, Mike. It's already going now.
Well, as you say, Pat, as you people age, we're getting an aging population. So again,
Yeah.
there's going to be more and more mobility issues. So I mean, all people always have to be thinking about it. I mean, if, as you said, Melissa, if you can improve the inclusivity of design, it helps everyone. The buggies, people pushing buggies around, drop curbs everywhere. They help people with mobility issues. I mean, there is just before this, there is one thing that there's no one solution fits all, because tactile paving that's really, really important for visually impaired, I find awful. But I mean, I can see that I have to live with the tactile paving because, if it's not there, somebody with a visual impairment is going to find it difficult. Sorry.
I think
And
that's
that
really
was our result as
important
well.
point.
So,
When
go
I
on,
started in
question.
Imperial, on the first day I started, I was told by the head to watch out when you step out on the road, because so many people, when we cross constantly on that exhibition road, which is without curbs, that's the key feature, that you don't realize you're suddenly in the road. So suddenly what may be a better solution for one group of users is really alienating for another group in there. And I just wanted to come back to your role as both someone with lived experience for 35 years and as an engineer. And typically, designers or engineers start a process with observing or with understanding people's needs. I think Pat just described it, where he brought users of different types, of different groups of users together to understand their needs in there. And I remember doing a class actually in New Zealand, forgotten about it, where we were looking at curbs and ramps. It was a design class, so it wasn't a research project. And we brought a user, he was 21-year-old, who had lost mobility from, I think, his second vertebra from his neck down during a rugby match. He was 21 years old. And I brought 100 students. We all came round while he showed and demonstrated how he got into his car and drove away. He had this device that would put his ramp in. Now, that is a certain way of designing, but that can have limitations. It can be quite challenging to actually work with users. And that's why the evidence that people like Pat bring is so important. Now, you're on the other side of that. So you've got both lived experience and experience as an engineer. What can you see? And we could start with you, Mike, and then maybe we can go to you, Pat, as what could be different ways of designing and bringing that lived experience to inform better design?
Well, I think, as you were just saying, it's requirements capture, and you need to get as wide a requirements capture as possible, and that means involving as many different groups as possible. I mean, I as I say, when I took early retirement, part of the thing I thought was I can go volunteer and do. I mean, all life has improved for me in terms of accessibility tremendously over the years. I mean, I didn't used to be able to get a bus. at all in Edinburgh. Now they're all accessible. So, I mean, things are improving. And so you're seeing more and more people with disabilities getting out there. As I say, that you've also got the aging population. There are far more people. So hopefully the requirements capture is going to be slightly easier because there is a higher level of awareness of the likely requirement. People who are designing anything should hopefully have seen somebody with a disability trying to do whatever activity they're designing for. So I'm hoping that sort of thing is going. Yeah.
And to carry on, as I think you suggested, Simon, I mean, the important thing is that there was a lot of data collected from a wide range of people. It wasn't just the people who ultimately went out. We ended up having to focus on low vision and movement capability, because that's practically, you only get a limited budget on these projects. You can't do everything that you want to do. But there was a lot of data in the reports about the other things that might be your capability limitation and how they were affected. And we interviewed people. We did phone interviews as well, over a wide range of people. Got a very interesting set of results, which are published in the 3 reports from Transport Scotland. So one little segue or report, if you like. While we were out there, I don't think you were with us that day, Mike. We were looking at cycleways in Edinburgh. I won't say where it is. And we had this safety system of people in high-vis vests at 4 corners around where we were working, so there was no danger of somebody being accidentally injured in the process. And we had the videographer going along with the user and recording what they were saying and what their ideas were. As we did that, a cyclist approached at high speed, did not slow down, and literally drove right through us. Yeah, he just went through the group, through the people with the white, yellow vests, past the guy with the wheelchair, and just disappeared off into the distance. And it's unspeakably, you could not predict that. You couldn't predict that. Somebody who's clearly in a wheelchair and is using a crossing, that person may or may not be able to see the approaching silent cyclists. And there you've got.
I think, Pat, this is a lot of this is to do with attitude. Because when I was in Japan, I was amazed at how there was somebody cycling through indoor mall in Osaka, where, I mean, it was like going down Princess Street on a Christmas, and yet somebody cycling through, and it all worked. Here we don't have the respect, and I'm not sure how we change that, but I think that's more of the issue. That's not part of the design of the infrastructure. It's how people react to it. And yeah.
But hold on. One of our findings was that silent approach by cyclists on these cycleways is a problem for visually impaired people, right?
Yes,
you can paint things on the road. You can do whatever you like. They and their dogs just don't hear these things coming, right? So there was a whole raft of findings to do with visual impairment. As you know, you were there when sometimes we were working with the dogs and so on, which nobody has ever found out before. And that's all gone into the report. But what it really means is we need to understand the conflicting requirements of different capabilities.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we were then asked to do a further project by Transport Scotland through Mark MacDonald, where they wanted to know precisely what the optimal curb heights were. And this is where it all started, because the civil engineers wanted to know, well, okay, if that's not the right height, what should it be? So out there in Expedition Road, they should have been curbs. The question is, how high? Okay, and we were able to do that. So we built a replica road surface with variable heighting, and we introduced the real curbs with different profiles. So they call them different types. They've got bull nose profiles. They've got flats of angled profiles. They've got different profiles. We tried those at different heights between one side of the other. And we asked these people to come in, people like Mike to come in, people with dogs, people with canes. And then within the laboratory, we asked them to traverse these curbs. And we looked at something called workload, which is a TLX NASA scale of measuring the amount of difficulty they were perceiving and feeling in different areas. And what we found out was there is a sort of optimal size. So in some cases, people with wheelchairs feel confident about traversing curves up to about, I would say, 25, 40 millimeters, somewhere thereabouts. Beyond that, they don't, because the wheelchairs have a tendency to tip. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, and I think you did that. And then we looked at wheelchairs with various attachments. This is interesting design variation. But then we looked at the visual side of it. People need to be able to detect the curves. Now, there's three
Yeah.
detections. One is you can see it. Low vision people have got vision, so they can see if there's high contrast, for example. The second one is if you use a cane, your detection method is by tapping the cane into them and running it along the surface. Not a widely understood situation by designers in design, road designers. And thirdly, of course, the dogs look at the road. The dog is looking at the curb. The dog feels or doesn't feel secure about the curb. And we managed to collect video data of all those scenarios. And then we did some work with statistics and so forth, and we established the sort of optimal height, which was then published in the Transport Scotland report, including all the data as well. I believe we would.
I love what you said, Mike, about like the empathy, and I think it's also something that it would be great to stress as much as possible as part of this episode, that you don't know. First of all, you don't know what you don't know, but then once you know, like we shouldn't be being blind about the situation where we are not the only like there's many different types of people in this world, animals including, etc., that we shouldn't be just not being conscious of different situations that people might be going through, right? So I think, I'm saying this because I'm a runner. So sometimes when I'm running, I see people walking, and I'm
Yeah.
like, oh my God, they're so slow. And then when I'm walking and people is running, I'm like, oh, these runners, they don't care. They don't care about anyone. They just want to run through, right? So I think in my experience, it's like you're always seeing the world through your own eyes, but that just gives you an example of like how myope sometimes we are on these situations. And I love that you said that, like, actually we should be looking at how can we be more conscious of the decisions that we're making, not only as designers when we're designing, but also as human beings of like,
Mm,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think it's
absolutely.
yeah, a
I think
really
there's
good
an
point.
important area which I've not mentioned here. We also discovered that, when crossings, various different crossings, I mean, this is work I'd like to continue in the future, and apparently it's possible we may be able to do that. But when the bleeps go off on these crossings, then apart from the difficulty of getting to the button, we've got some fantastic video of Mike struggling to get to a button on one of those crossings because it's badly positioned. But apart from that, the bleeping noises aren't very directional. So you get these quite complicated junctions, especially in Edinburgh Centre, where there are multiple boxes. And as they're bleeping away, it was reported to us that it's very difficult to understand where those bleeping noises are coming from, which, given that you are a blind individual trying to make a decision about when to cross, is not an ideal situation. So this adds to stress. And what we're really talking about is if people who are in that situation who aren't too familiar with where they're going, and they would like to be, or they'd like a carer to go with them to familiarize themselves, and that's part of the equation as well. But they're apprehensive. Who would not be apprehensive under those circumstances?
Yeah.
It's a horrendous situation to put our people in, on the streets. And my last point would be that if you look at the road paint around these new cycleways, I mean, apart from the fact that in Edinburgh, some of them end in a brick wall because the roads aren't finished. So there is every possibility you would following the cycleway, you just slam into the wall. But I mean, that's the problem. That's the problems with roadworks, of course. But the other thing is it's cognitively confusing. So, you might, especially traveling at speed on a bicycle, you may not really understand where you're expected to go. And certainly if you're a person in a wheelchair or with low vision, you're not going to know where things are coming at you from. So these are all part of the design equation, if you like, for the future of our streets. I have great hopes
That's
for this area, you know.
Yeah, That's a really important point, Pat, because I think you bring in multiple perspectives in there. I certainly, and I'm a cyclist as well, and I have a mother-in-law who's blind, so I do also have experience on both sides. I'm also run and walk, and I have a dog, so I can see your annoyance in each perspective of the other users.
Mhm.
Looking at that, though, it seems really challenging. So that question about what size should the curb be? The curb.
Mm.
That is really hard to answer because it's probably a different answer for many of those people. And there's so many
And different
conflicts and there's
places as well. So
requirements.
if it's the
Yeah,
junction between the cycleway and the road, the junction between
yeah,
the cycleway and the street, they're all different. They all have different roles. And one
yeah,
final role, which no designer can forget, is to stop the cars and vehicles running over you. You know, that
yeah.
that's one
That is one
role,
of the most important ones,
the
actually.
traditional
So,
role, if you
yeah,
like, of curbs. Yeah,
yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite interesting. I've worked with a cycling company that make this smart lights. They've actually done a podcast, so they will be in one of the podcasts with us. And that data is being used to inform cycling infrastructure for safety of cyclists. But it is one perspective. So was thinking in that planning of that infrastructure, we really need data about all those perspectives, and it's quite
Mhm.
challenging to bring that together. Really, really challenging.
In
Mm.
Canada, they paint the curbs in different colors,
Yeah,
right?
but I think about
Well, we
my
asked
mother-in-law, she won't
Edinburgh.
see that. She
No.
won't see that,
Well, we
right?
asked in Edinburgh why they don't do it, and we were told that it despoils the image of Edinburgh, which is
Mm.
a
Oh,
sort of, they don't want brightly coloured roads. So instead, they go for these slightly sort of, you know, muted brown colours, which of course reduces the contrast, and so on.
yeah.
Particularly in cycleways. I mean, they do it in cycleways, but they do it in other. I mean, they deliberately do it. This is the bizarre thing about it. When you could improve the visibility for low visual people, but the legacy of the Edinburgh
Yep.
feel, the feel of Edinburgh, is fighting you there.
Well, Edinburgh cycleways, I mean, the recent ones, they've just installed some on Leith Walk, which are
Mm.
zigzags all the way down. I mean, I cycle a lot, but I tend to just stay on the roads because the cycleways are so poor and you have to give way at junctions. I mean, if you're going, I mean, the cycleways are not designed for people using cycles, I would suggest. It's purely to get people who are not confident out cycling.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about the complexities of all the different users and the conflicting requirements and how to resolve that. And I think one of the other takeaways I've had from here is understanding, sort of opening up new areas and possibilities. So your first example of the device to enable passengers, wheelchair passengers, to take small aircrafts and partnering with companies. So that was identified somehow. And that partnering enables that idea to become a reality in some point in time. So hopefully that will be a reality, which will open up really new experiences. So I also see it as a challenge that we haven't quite resolved, because the idea of bringing and working with users is great, but it is also quite, you'd have to cover so many different cases. And even someone with a design background, I'd be thinking I wouldn't know the answer to that curb bit. And as you say, it's sometimes related to areas. So some of our cycling data shows certain areas, it's typically junctions, are really bad for safety. And so those different perspectives are quite at conflict with each other. I was just thinking, Mike, is there a single takeaway that you'd like to give before we close the episode?
Well, I think when you're designing anything, you're temporarily able-bodied. You, as a designer, could end up in a wheelchair quite easily. So you need to be thinking
Mhm.
about, inclusive design all the way through. Anything that you could do to make whatever you're designing better and more inclusive. Just think about it, because if you can get it in at the first stage, it makes life so much easier all the way through.
Thank you. And Pat, did you want to give a short
Answering your
takeaway?
questions, Lou, I think that's a very, very good question. I think we don't intend. I mean, I would like to go on doing, but what we will look at specific areas. So it won't be curbs. It might be floating bus stops and things like this, other types of problems that they're out struggling with, maybe even cycleways. These are all things I'd like to look into more detail. And what we're really doing is evidencing specific cases. Another one is, of course, crossings, because I think we established, Mike, that most of the crossings there were not optimally designed, and some of them were frightening and some of them difficult to use. So I think that's one side of it. How do you approach the problem from a research perspective? You don't sample everybody because it's not going to happen, but you do approach it from a strategic way. You say, well, these are the key areas that the stakeholders want to know about. They are the people ultimately who will give us the money, and in their world is completely different from ours. So this sort of research, I think, which is, I think, the future. If we're going to make our streets easier to use by everybody, at the moment it's kind of a wild west where people just do whatever they think is appropriate or works, and it's only after the complaints start flooding in, especially with cycleways. Leith Walk is a good example, but there are many others in Glasgow and other cities. Almost immediately they're built, the complaints start to come in. And there has to be an understanding there, I think, of the process by which these projects are commissioned. And I think this is a great example of how design goes far beyond just the evidencing of the immediate difficulties, but it starts with the immediate difficulties.
Yeah. And perhaps those complaints are evidence of other difficulties that can help, you can learn from and move to the next generation of design. So thank you, Mike, and thank you, Pat, and of course, Melissa, for this podcast. And we're excited that in the next episode, we're going to bring Professor John Clarkson, CBE, and the head of the Engineering Design Centre from Cambridge University, who has worked with inclusive design. But in this case, we're going to talk to him about his systems and engineering design thinking that he's been applying to the healthcare systems over the last 10 or 15 years. Thank you. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think, or if you have an idea for a future guest or topic, at www.decodedpodcast.com.
Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you listen, and follow us on TikTok and Instagram at decoded.podcast. See you!